Cool. I welcome Dr. Khan to speak.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, distinguished excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished parliamentarians in particular. Welcome you here to the United Nations headquarters to this very important gathering. And in particular, I'd like to thank our distinguished colleagues, His Excellency Ambassador Abdurrahmanov, the permanent representative of Kazakhstan, Madam Gallo, the distinguished Minister Councillor of Italy, and of course, Madam Irina Bukova, who unfortunately had to leave us, but of course we want to thank UNESCO under her great leadership for co-sponsoring this event together with the Interparliamentary Coalition for Global Ethics, and in particular Madam Shoshona, with whom we have been interacting for this very important high-level panel. And it is indeed a very good opportunity for us here at the United Nations to interface with so many parliamentarians from around the world who, in the democratic spirit, we believe very sincerely, particularly with regard to the challenge that we face, the challenge of violent extremism that is sweeping the world, that we must improve the interaction and interface with you, the parliamentarians, who represent the citizens of the world in the truest sense, and that this sort of dialogue has to go beyond the sort of esoteric academic to the very real issues with which you have to deal with on a day-to-day basis with regard to your political constituencies, with regard to the citizens that you serve, and through you, what we do here at the United Nations in supporting your very eminent and very challenging work around the world. The subject before us today, that of violent extremism, is perhaps one of the great challenges of our time in the 21st century. The reason is obvious. It is not a challenge that is endemic to any one particular nation, any particular one region, or to any one particular society. If we look at one manifestation of violent extremism today, there are foreign terrorist fighters from over 100 countries. And I'm sure that many of you who are represented here know of citizens from your own state who have ventured at a very young age, in some cases, as adolescents, young men and women who are full of promise and hope, who have gone to far lands in order to be drawn and inspired by evil ideologies that lead them ultimately to death, destruction, and mayhem. This is the challenge that we have, the challenge of preventing and ultimately saving our young children, because it is the young generation, the generation of 16 to 24-year-olds in our societies who are most vulnerable. And they are not only the future leaders, not only the future hope of our societies, but the citizens of our future societies who will build or not build the rest of the 21st century that lies ahead of us. And so we have an urgent agenda before us to build, as the theme of this session today, to build peaceful and inclusive societies. It is such a very apt theme for discussion, because without building an inclusive society, participatory society, and ultimately a peaceful society, we will have young people in particular on the margins, some of them not just marginalized, some of them highly educated, who are being drawn to these other alternative ideologies that preach death, destruction, and mayhem. Violent extremism is a direct assault on the United Nations Charter for all that it stands for, and a grave threat to democracy that you represent around the world. Because violent extremists not only oppose participatory government, they forcefully suppress the enjoyment of human and civil and political and economic and social rights. At the same time, violent extremists seek to divide and polarize our societies. And for this reason, we must refrain from assigning collective guilt to whole communities and religions, which would only be further exploited by such groups. Indeed, violent extremist groups main agenda is not only to spill blood, but ultimately to sow the seeds of discord and polarization and what is now a debunked myth, that of the clash of civilizations. We must forcefully reject their agenda of polarization and clash of civilizations. We must come together in an inclusive manner to confront this threat. Irrespective of the religions or the cultures or the nationalities or the ethnicities that we may represent. Violent extremism is a global threat. It transcends cultures and geographical boundaries and should not be associated with any one religion, nationality, or ethnic group. Indeed, today, violent extremists control territory, resources, and populations, and have blurred borders between sovereign states. The net result is a volatile vortex between protracted conflicts, terrorism, and violent extremism, which further enables violent extremists to thrive. And one of the challenges for us in places which are affected by conflict, protracted conflicts, by this vicious vortex, is to break that vortex so that new theaters of conflict are not also affected by terrorism and violent extremism. As I said earlier, young people in particular are targeted by violent extremists and sometimes blamed for their actions. We see sensational headlines about young killers or young women who join terrorist movements, and it is a distorted picture that fails to demonstrate the important contribution that young people are making largely around the world to peaceful and inclusive societies. The vast majority of young people are contributing to the progress of their societies, to the promotion of democracy and the building of peace. And we need to support that in a much more forceful, focused and constructive manner. For the past few years, the international community's response to violent extremism has been centered on countering the threat. Security and military responses alone obviously cannot defeat this scourge. And that is why we now need to look at a much more comprehensive and balanced approach. We need to engage earlier and address the drivers or the root causes of violent extremism before it comes to a military and security threat, which we have to then address through security measures. There is, of course, no single pathway and no complete or obvious algorithm that can unlock the secrets about what turns the wheels of violent extremism. But we know that violent extremism flourishes when aspirations for inclusion and participation and democracy are frustrated, marginalized groups linger on the sidelines of societies, when political space shrinks, and when too many people, especially young people, lack prospects and meaning in their lives. The Secretary General of the United Nations, His Excellency Mr. Ban Ki-moon, has made the prevention of violent extremism one of the highest priorities in his tenure. In January of this year, as some of our colleagues on the podium mentioned, the Secretary General presented a comprehensive plan of action to prevent violent extremism to the United Nations General Assembly, with over 70 recommendations for member states, as well as to parliaments and to civil society around the world, measures to address the drivers of violent extremism in 7 core priority areas. And I encourage you to please look at this global plan of action that the United Nations has developed. My own UN Counterterrorism Implementation Task Force brought 37 UN agencies together to develop this plan of action for the Secretary General, which has now been reviewed and endorsed and welcomed by the General Assembly during its 5th review of the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy 2 weeks ago. The UN General Assembly resolution recommends that member states, quote, consider the implementation of relevant recommendations of the plan of action as applicable to the national context, and it encourages UN entities in line with their mandates to implement relevant recommendations of the plan of action, including by providing technical assistance to member states. And we are now mobilizing on looking at how, in a very systematic way, all the relevant UN agencies that are part of the UN Counterterrorism Implementation Task Force can help member states, governments, parliaments, civil society to ultimately take national ownership. Because ultimately, the primary responsibility for the prevention of violent extremism must, of course, remain with member states, with you, the nations and parliaments that are represented here. And to this end, the Secretary General has advocated that every country consider developing a national plan of action to prevent violent extremism. Clearly, the parliaments of the world, each one of you, have a critical role to play, particularly in providing the legislative framework for the development of those national PVE or national plans of action for the prevention of violent extremism. So that is the challenge before us, distinguished delegates, the challenge of forging national and also regional plans of action to prevent violent extremism, because only through concerted, cooperative, international action, regional action, national action, local action, in a mutually reinforcing way, can we impact on this phenomenon. There is, as our distinguished panelists said, no magic wand, no magic solution, no quick fix. In fact, the danger of looking for quick fixes can sometimes often complicate the challenge of addressing some of the very complex aspects of violent extremism. The Secretary General's plan of action particularly calls for the empowerment of young people, women and community leaders, as well as fostering education, skills development and employment facilitation as part of our common struggle against poverty and social marginalization. Young people, who constitute the majority of the population of many countries around the world, must be viewed as a positive asset and must be empowered to make their constructive contribution to the political and economic development of their societies and nations. They obviously represent a huge untapped resource. It is the largest young population in the history of the world. And the parliaments that are represented here have a critical role to play in mobilizing, including, and fostering the young people of today so that they can make and unleash the huge potential that they can represent for the development of their respective communities and nations. The General Assembly particularly welcomed UNESCO's engagement with member states to implement strategies to prevent violent extremism conducive to terrorism through education. And here I would like to also add my voice of thanks and appreciation to the great leadership that Madam Irina Bokova, Director General of UNESCO, has played in leading UNESCO and the international community in fostering the contribution of education to the development of young people and their great potential in contributing to the prevention of violent extremism. Following the General Assembly's encouragement to the UN system, to the UN agencies, we are now, as I said earlier, mobilizing to bring the UN system under the leadership of the Secretary General through a high-level PVE action group to support you, the member states, the parliaments around the world, civil society, all the relevant bodies that can help forge a common global movement in preventing violent extremism around the world. This remains one of the highest priorities of the current Secretary General, His Excellency Mr. Ban Ki-moon, because we must focus our attention to shifting the paradigm, if you like, from a security-based counter-narrative towards a common prevention effort.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jehangir, for your important words and stressing how important to tackle the roots of conflict and how important to have a good governance to marginalize these extremists in our world, under religion or otherwise. I think it is very, very important with the experience in Iraq, in Pakistan, in United Nations, in Saudi Arabia. You must have lots of experience, which is very useful. And thank you very much for your words.